Currently, China is considered the world's second-largest economy. The country is the largest exporter and producer of technology. But it doesn't stop there. Chinese factories produce everything, and virtually every industrialized product we use today is manufactured there. Some may not be entirely produced in the country, but at least one piece or technology used came from a Chinese industry. Companies from all over the world use Chinese labor, and if it weren't for that, their production costs would be at least triple. This high industrialization has made China, which until the 1980s was a predominantly rural, traditional, and underdeveloped country, become one of the world's greatest powers. The rise of China was one of the fastest and most impressive in all of modern world history. At the same time that the country has cheapened various technologies for the entire planet, it has also created a high dependence on virtually all major existing companies. And the implications for global trade can be at least catastrophic. Learn more about the rise of China and what are the implications for global trade that all this industrial monopoly can bring to the world in the coming years. But before that, leave a like on this video if this topic interested you, and also subscribe to the channel so as not to miss any new videos here on Visionary Businesses. For years, China was considered an underdeveloped country with a predominantly rural economy, where its population faced various social and economic problems. The Chinese economy was entirely planned and controlled by the government, and during the first decades of the People's Republic of China, which began in 1949, problems such as political instability and famine were recurrent. Most companies were nationalized, making their industrial sector limited and inefficient. Markets were suppressed and productivity reduced, leading to a decrease in the quality of life for a large portion of the Chinese population. But in 1978, the scenario began to change. Deng Xiaoping, the responsible for China's economic opening, led a movement of economic reform, with the goal of modernizing the Chinese economy and making the country more competitive in the global market. The reforms implemented by Deng included the creation of special economic zones, the reduction of bureaucracy and state control over Chinese companies, the creation of incentives for the private sector, and the adoption of policies to encourage foreign investment. It is worth noting that in 1978, when Deng Xiaoping took power, China was a highly traditional country, and opening the market to foreign investments was not seen with good eyes by the majority of the population. But despite opposition, the measures were gradually implemented, and the Chinese economy opened up to negotiations with some Asian countries at first, but in less than 40 years, they became global. The first foreign companies to enter China after the economic reforms were mainly companies from Hong Kong, such as Tunghua Group, which built a watch factory in Shenzhen in 1979, and Taiwan, such as Foxconn, which built an electronic products factory also in Shenzhen in 1988. They were mainly attracted by the cheap and abundant workforce and also by the large consumer market in China, which at the time already had 956 million inhabitants. Several other foreign companies quickly began operations in the country, and from the 1990s, Western companies began to invest on a large scale in China. This is the case of major brands such as General Motors, Intel, McDonald's, and Coca-Cola, which also established operations in China, taking advantage of the high demand for their products and services and the growing political and economic stability of the country. Currently, several foreign companies depend almost exclusively on Chinese labor to produce their products or components, especially in sectors such as electronics, clothing, footwear, toys, furniture, and even automobiles. Some examples are Apple, as the American technology giant produces most of its products in China, including the famous iPhones, iPads, and MacBooks. Foxconn, which still maintains its operations in the country, remains one of Apple's main suppliers in China. Nike also produces the majority of its products in China and has a large presence in the country, with various factories in China producing shoes not only for Nike, but also for several other sportswear brands. General Motors, an American automaker known in Brazil as Chevrolet, has a strong presence in China, producing most of its cars sold in the country through partnerships with Chinese companies. Amazon, the e-commerce giant, relies almost exclusively on Chinese suppliers to produce many of the products sold on its site, such as electronics, toys, clothing, and other consumer goods. These are just a few of the brands that rely almost exclusively on Chinese labor to remain competitive in the global market. This makes them dependent on the country to continue to exist, but a curious fact is that the Chinese do not depend on any of these companies, at least for consumption, as for each of them, there is a more famous national substitute used by the Chinese population. In China, they do not use brands that are popular in the West, such as the cell phones used by the Chinese that are from Chinese companies like Huawei and Xiaomi. Google also does not operate in China and none of its services are used. This has made China somewhat independent of the international market, while the rest of the planet relies on China for the production of consumer goods. This is the case for companies like AliExpress and TikTok that have been dominating a large part of the global market, each in its specific sector, toppling American companies like Amazon and Meta. This detail has raised several concerns, especially on the part of the United States, as China is building a power that could have serious implications for global trade. Can China dominate the global economy? There are indications that point to China dominating the entire global economy in the future, and that even the dollar could fall into disuse, being replaced by the Chinese currency, the yuan. Among these indications, the first is related to unfair competition. Imagine if China decided to stop producing for other companies and started providing its own products using its vast industrialized labor force. No other company in the world could compete, and the giant companies mentioned earlier could go bankrupt overnight. Due to this factor, geopolitical tensions have been increasing dramatically in recent years, especially with the United States, as some experts claim that American economic hegemony may be numbered. Another indication is that due to this dependence of many foreign companies on Chinese labor, there is a risk of even political and national security implications. This concern arises because China is considered an authoritarian country and can use its influence over companies operating on its territory for political purposes. After all, no company that depends on China will want to oppose the country, as the consequence will invariably decrease its profit and could even end the business. However, an even more sensitive indication is the dependence of foreign companies on China to produce critical products, such as electronic components, as these can be seen as a national security risk in some countries. In case of conflicts, China can use its control over these products to exert pressure on other countries and harm their defense capability. The situation became clear after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as while the UN and much of the world cut commercial ties with Russia, China ended up doing even more business with the country. And due to the fact that basically the whole world depends on China, no country will intervene and dare to cut commercial ties directly with the country as was done with Russia in 2022. This situation is only exposing the economic dependence of the rest of the world on China and bringing to light the reality that China may indeed dominate the global economy in the coming years, taking the place that was occupied by the United States. But what about you? Do you believe that China will dominate the world economy? Do you currently use any Chinese brand or company in your daily life? Leave a comment, I would love to know your answer. China's rise is undoubtedly impressive, as the country went from underdeveloped to one of the world's major powers in less than 50 years. The country has become so important in the world economic scenario that it is even threatening to take the place of the United States, the world's largest economy. We cannot say that China's plan has always been to dominate global trade, but the result achieved by the country was exactly this, and the main factor undoubtedly was cheap and specialized labor. But now, what can the rest of the world do to not depend exclusively on China? This is a question that world leaders have been asking themselves daily in recent times. And the answer? Well, I leave that to you in the comments. Tell me below what you think can be done so that China does not completely dominate world trade. Also, leave your like if you like this video, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any updates here on Visionary Business. Thank you very much for watching so far, and see you next time.